Yes, and
the ultimate goal is to be able to do that.
And-
But obviously,
Yes.
being able to take them and moving through those well.
and your plasma gets
You've got one go.
your plasma gets bigger, and you do that gradually, and that becomes star inhabiting, and it doesn't happen all at once. And but in terms of the, they say 22 different star systems involved in cooking up Earth's DNA. I thought we'd drag out those slides later. We do a little more science first before we get to the far out cosmic stuff and scare everybody away.
Cool.
Yes.
That's cool. So
Okay.
And like, where do we go after we go somewhere? Okay, we take our military death, and then navigate.
Actually, the only way out of here is through the sun, because it's the only thing with the inertial escape velocity.
And what's after that?
Well, that basically then the next solar fractal. Well, the way Gurdjieff described it is useful, that planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically, as when Jodie Foster traveled wormholes in contact. That there's a wormhole from the center of the Earth to the center of the sun, but don't try to use it when the moon's in the way.
Okay.
Really. But then the center of the sun, we saw, is the Anu structure. It's cool and inviting. It's an eyeball. It's very friendly to plasma if you can do compression well. And so any solar shaman, and you can see many stories at the Solar Shamans e-group. We co-founded Solar Heart Community at yahoogroups.com, of what it's like to see through the sun like an eyeball, which is an introduction. And Bentoff's second book, after his Kundalini, called The Cosmic Comic Book, was about his interstellar travels, actually, which is basically that you see that the local universe is basically a saddle shape on the surface of a torus, and that if you see that from a distance, the replication of stars actually looks like DNA. That's really what he wrote, and I think he was right. And above and below that helix of replicating galaxies, you see a little black hole, which, if you know anything about cellular biophysics, is called a centriole. The centriole forms above and below the replicating helix of DNA, like a black hole, to organize the microtubules in that double cone, phase conjugation, meiosis, mitosis, except in this case on an interstellar scale. So we're going to learn about that a bit more when we talk about alphabets. Yes?
Isn't that about going home? Going home.
Yeah.
Well, when they say home is where the heart is, they kind of mean home is where distribution is perfect. Where, a heart's literally a map of phase conjugation, the Valentine. So a place where you can circulate your charge is called home. As you find larger and larger fractal structures, you can inhabit larger and larger plasma bodies.
Some of the native people in Australia still have dominant memories of where to go. They've only just been brave enough to come out with it. So,
Good. Good.
you know, an individual process, of course, but it can be guided by our being and by the star brothers. And sisters who what's that word from, cultivate the earth.
They call them the galactic core cultures. They were seeding DNA among stars. But the history book I'm going to recommend later today when we do this story is called Chronicles of Girku by Anton Parks. I feel he goes much further than Zecharia Sitchin to the origins of the Anunnaki with what's called the Uras culture. And in that, for example, as you mentioned Pleiades, dear, when the family of Anunnaki was Anu, the father, the same as the shape that we talk about, Anu was the father. He was running from the Orion Wars, from Alpha Draconis. Alpha Draconis, the origin of Uras, was the pole star of the time. And the shadow of Alpha Draconis is the Arabic letter L, as in Elohim. And the star there, Thuban, is probably the origin of our term Theuba and Yahweh. And at that time, the culture of the high Uras, whom you would call seraphim, was androgynous. But when they became sexual, they started to fight. Old story. They actually developed a different language for the men versus the women, separate language, Amisa, and that separation extends all the way down to the caste system and the Aboriginal marriage law today, which came from Uru Alpha Draconis. But the point I was going to make was that when they're in their flight from the Orion Wars, at the time Anu did the illegal genetic, later called Enki, Ea, Adonai, Lucifer, also known as Zoroaster, also known as Ra, Abram, and as Kiliman in South Africa, as in Kilimanjaro. And Enki was illegal genetically because at that time, only cloning was legal, which is part of how they lost their soul, that physics, loss of implosion in DNA. The reason we tell the history story is to tell the science story, to make the science story interesting. And the history story was, part of their flight from the Orion Wars was the fact that Enki in the family himself was illegal. And where they launched from, when Anu brought the Anunnaki here for the gold mine slave operation, was Pleiades. For this, you see, at that time they were, the loss of fractality in their planet's grid meant the atmosphere was going bye-bye. Does that sound familiar? Good. Should sound familiar. And the way you fix that is you spray a gold vapor, which restores phase conjugate fractality and therefore atmosphere maintenance. And so they launched the gold mining operation. And the reason the solar system held the most gold was because of that, right there. The solar system here is at the phase conjugate implosion angle between Pleiades, Orion, and Sirius. That's a 60-degree implosion phase angle, which conjugates here. And this gravity wind from Orion was called Peshmatan by the Hopi, became Deep Space Nine. And the reason there's 9 donuts here is the plasma physics of the whale dream, Sri Yantra, Deep Space Nine, Anunnaki 9, Egyptian Ennead, 9 steps of Palenque, 9 steps in Dante's Inferno, etc. The point is the Pleiadian origin fits. So if you read Anton Parks and that whole story of the Uras culture, it fits the origin stories of many many indigenous people, including the Aboriginals, many of whom do mention Pleiades and the Seven Sisters. Me. Many people believe that they're still eating the gold. And I think there's some truth to that. But again, we're looking for the physics here. We'll play with the history, but we're looking for the physics. Sitchin was right in that if you vaporize gold powder in air, you can restore atmosphere. If you vaporize gold powder or any of the PGM metals in volcanic glass, you make projective powder and the Philosopher's Stone, and that's how they made gold in John Dee's early alchemy. At that time, since they didn't have a way to produce the necessary heat, they used volcanic glass, and they would vaporize the PGM, platinum, gold, or palladium in a vapor through the glass. And that's what happened naturally in the meteorite called the Kaaba of the Muslims. And they ground up about 40% of that, and then the mad caliph wouldn't let them take any more. So Kelly went to Dee, and they found the meteorite that formed the rose that is Bohemia, Prague, and the remnant of that meteorite is what John Dee used to make the gold that's well documented historically. You take a bit of that, the same way that the Templars made red glass, vaporized gold through the glass, and if you put a little bit of that in a wax